All right, so it was about a week ago now that President Joe Biden came out and essentially accused Putin of being a war criminal, and also kind of sort of in a very off-the-cuff way suggesting that he didn't want Putin to remain in power. And they sort of had to walk this back in a half-assed way because obviously you don't want to inflame the current situation. You don't want to make Vladimir Putin feel as though he's being entirely backed into a corner and that the US is conducting an active regime change operation. So they kind of sort of walked it back. But just a couple days ago on April 4th, President Biden came out and doubled down on not only calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal, which is accurate, but also suggesting that he should face a war crimes tribunal. So let's go ahead and watch this clip and then I'll give you guys my thoughts on it.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter, you saw what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal. And what's happening in Bucha is outrageous. And everyone's seen it. Up to Allah. No, I think it is a war crime.
What are you going to do about it, sir? Are you going to do more sanctions on Russia?
I'm seeking more sanctions, yes. I'll have time to announce that to you. He should be held accountable. Well, no.
What else can you do?
No. Go to the war crime tribunal. Yes, I'm going to continue to add sanctions. Thank you. I'll let you know.
Okay, so there's a lot of different things to say about that, right? So first of all, on the substance of it, with the recent crimes that we saw committed in Bucha, which is this region sort of on the outskirts of Kyiv, where after Ukrainian security forces retook it, they came upon some dead bodies that were essentially strewn about in the streets in a very brutal way, that had been apparently shot in the back of the head, and average civilians that had been killed during this Russian invasion. And there's a lot of details there that it seems like people are still trying to get firm information on, and I'll probably do a video covering that once I get a more firm idea on the details of all of that. So on the substance of this, right, on the substance of whether or not Vladimir Putin is in fact a war criminal, yeah, I mean, unambiguously he is 100% committing war crimes, whether in Bucha or around the entire country. We've seen him bomb civilian infrastructure. We've seen widespread killings of innocent men, women, and children. So yeah, by the same definitions, I would call somebody like George W. Bush or somebody like Joe Biden himself a war criminal. I would also apply that label to a guy like Vladimir Putin, and it really shouldn't be that hard for just average people to recognize that, yeah, he is a war criminal. But that's sort of a different question than whether or not the President of the United States, or whether or not the official position of the US government should be that not only are we declaring Vladimir Putin to be a war criminal, but also, as President Biden is saying right here, that he should face a war crimes tribunal, that he should be brought in front of a trial of some sort and actually held accountable for this. Now, that's an entirely different escalation, which I don't think is beneficial to anybody in this situation, because if the goal at the end of the day is to end the war in Ukraine and, get some sort of a diplomatic solution on the table, then do you really think it's going to be beneficial to accuse him of being a war criminal and suggest that once the war ends, if it ever does end, that you're going to, bring him to The Hague and try him for war crimes? It seems like that might make him feel like he is being backed into a corner and that he has no other, possible way out of this but to continue escalating the war, and that would not be helpful to anybody. It wouldn't be helpful to Americans as this conflict heats up and brings us closer to World War III. It wouldn't be helpful to Vladimir Putin for obvious reasons, not that you want to appease him in any way, but it also, importantly, would not be beneficial to the Ukrainian people, as you are, again, should be at least trying to push for a diplomatic off-ramp. So this is that famous saying that I think comes from Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and it might sound a little bit corny, but it's also valid in a situation like this. When somebody like Vladimir Putin has been facing the military breakdown that we have seen since he invaded Ukraine. I mean, they thought that they were going to take Kyiv in just a matter of days. Now, we're already, a month and a half into this war. He's clearly failed on some of their major military objectives, but Sun Tzu in The Art of War, again, the phrase is, you want to build your enemy a golden bridge to retreat across, meaning when your opponent, in this case Russia, feels that they have had some massive military failures and maybe there's a little bit of embarrassment on the part of the Russian military and on the part of Vladimir Vladimir Putin in this context. You want to give them an off-ramp so that you can reduce the likelihood that this is just going to continue escalating. Because again, if your priority is on the well-being of the Ukrainian people, then bringing about an end to the war as quickly as possible should be your goal. And this does not serve the interests of, providing that golden bridge for Vladimir Putin to retreat across. And again, just ratcheting it up on top of the sanctions, the nuclear sanctions we've already thrown at Vladimir Putin and at Russia, threatening even more sanctions. So again, he's only talking about escalation here. He's not talking about any sort of off-ramp or de-escalation in any way, shape, or form. And again, we've talked about this on my channel a couple of times, and I'll probably do a whole video breaking down the sanctions and how they haven't really been working, but that's the reality of the situation. We have slapped Russia with more sanctions than any other country we've ever slapped with sanctions before in history, and yet, if you go look at the Russian ruble, it's recovered damn near to where it was before the war. If you go and look at the actual situation of what sanctions are doing politically within Russia, it seems like it's only bolstered Vladimir Putin's approval rating within Russia. So it's like there's even a question of whether or not the sanctions are even working, and yet still Joe Biden, his only solution in the official position of the US government is not to be aggressively lobbying for a diplomatic off-ramp, but is just to continue escalating. Now, that's just on the side of the strategic, benefits or strategic consequences of Biden coming out and saying something like this. And we haven't even gotten into the glaring hypocrisy of a president of the U.S. empire coming out and accusing somebody else of being a war criminal and suggesting that we have war crimes tribunals for that war criminal. It's like, okay, fine. I would be happy for that. I'm not a fan of Vladimir Putin. I think he should be held accountable for the war crimes that he is responsible for. And again, the same way that I think George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden himself should also be held at a tribunal and held for the war crimes that they are responsible for. So, I mean, this is just a couple months ago when we were leaving Afghanistan. No U.S. troops will be punished for deadly Kabul strike, Pentagon chief decides. The military initially defended the strike. They lied about it, which killed 10 civilians. Remember, they told us it was an ISIS-K suicide bomber. No suicide bomber was ever found. It was just 10 innocent civilians. But ultimately, they called it a tragic mistake. Okay, so when President Joe Biden commits a war crime like this, wipes out an entire family, lies about it on top of that, when the Pentagon, when the U.S. military, when Joe Biden is responsible for war crimes, it's, oh, whoops, I guess it was just a tragic mistake and nothing could be done about it. Can't hold anybody responsible for this. But when it's Vladimir Putin committing war crimes, it's, okay, we need to lock him up immediately and do regime change. It's a glaring hypocrisy, and it's not even about doing a whataboutism. It's just like you are undercutting the ability, you are undercutting the validity of your accusations of war crimes and your push for a war crimes tribunal by having the United States and other war crime committing countries lead this charge. I mean, it's a complete fucking joke. But this again is being pushed not only by President Joe Biden, it's also being reinforced in mainstream media outlets. So here's just a little excerpt from a Washington Post article. They say, U.S. support for an ICC investigation, the International Criminal Court, investigation of Russian war crimes would not constitute a double standard or be inconsistent with U.S. objections to the court's claimed jurisdiction over U.S. personnel. The United States can help the court in appropriate cases while still strongly opposing ICC investigations, including of U.S. personnel, that do not meet the court's strict threshold requirements. So, okay, listen, first of all, we are not a party to the ICC. Okay, don't know if you guys know this, but the United States has not ratified the Rome Statute requirements to be admitted into accepting the ICC's jurisdiction. So we reject their jurisdiction over the United States, all of our military personnel, and also over many of our allies that are also guilty of committing war crimes. So how are you going to not even allow the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court to even investigate U.S. war crimes, but you're going to push them and you're going to try to leverage the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to go investigate Russian war crimes? It's just, open yourself up to the same exact standards that you are trying to apply to another country. But again, just another example of the glaring hypocrisy of this entire situation here from Al Jazeera. U.S. opposes ICC war crimes probe, citing support for Israel. So this was specifically going to be an ICC probe into war crimes that were committed both by Israel and by groups like Hamas. So it was going to go both ways. It was just going to be an independent analysis of what are the war crimes, the crimes that have been committed between Israel and Palestinian people. And some of the details of this are just absolutely laughable. So let's go ahead and read some of this. They say, Secretary of State says the U.S. firmly opposes the ICC investigation into alleged war crimes in Palestinian territory. So the United States firmly opposes and is deeply disappointed by the International Criminal Court's decision to open a war crimes investigation. Again, an investigation, not even a trial, in the occupied Palestinian territories, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said, and the investigation, which was announced on Wednesday, this is an article from March 4th of 2021, comes after a February ICC determination that the occupied Palestinian territories fall under its jurisdiction, paving the way for an investigation of war crimes committed by both Palestinians and Israelis. So if you're Israel and your main contention is that, oh, well, it's the Palestinian people and Hamas that are being the primary aggressors and they're the ones who are the actual war criminals in this situation, then you should be able to step back and say, okay, let's do an investigation. Let's do an investigation to actions that have been committed by Palestinians, and we're going to investigate actions committed by Israelis. But of course, they don't want that investigation because they know that they would also be found guilty of widespread war crimes and human rights abuses. But they continue saying, quote, the ICC has no jurisdiction over this matter. Israel is not a party to the ICC and has not consented to the court's jurisdiction, and we have serious concerns about the ICC's attempts to exercise its jurisdiction over Israeli personnel, Blinken said in a statement. So again, this is an entirely bullshit premise because Israel themselves do not have to be a party to the ICC in order for there to be an investigation done. All it has to be is a recognition from Palestinians, who are one of the victims in this situation, that they have jurisdiction. And then if Palestinians welcome this investigation, then it shouldn't matter what Israel's objections to it are, right? Okay, so this would be the same situation as, like, you know, Afghanistan civilians trying to get a war crimes investigation into Afghanistan. It's like, yeah, because that's their country. They are the ones who are having the war crimes committed against them. It wouldn't be, you know, on the United States to determine whether or not that's a valid investigation. It's like, you are the ones who just committed the crimes. Of course, you shouldn't be able to determine who gets to investigate, who's going to investigate those crimes. So they continue saying, quote, the Palestinians do not qualify as a sovereign state and therefore are not qualified to obtain membership as a state in, participate as a state in, or delegate jurisdiction to the ICC, he said. But a resolution passed by the United Nations in 2012 changed the occupied Palestinian territories from an observer entity to a non-member observer state, a de facto recognition of sovereignty that opened the door for the ICC's ruling on jurisdiction. So again, he's just straight up lying about the ICC's jurisdiction in Palestinian territories. But even the way that they phrase this, I mean, they don't qualify as a sovereign state. Okay, but why? Why do Palestinians not have a state? Well, it's because of this ongoing ethnic cleansing and apartheid that is being enforced violently by Israel. So, you know, you can't just turn around and say, oh, because we're doing this violent ethnic cleansing and apartheid, therefore you don't have jurisdiction over the people that we are doing these crimes against. Again, it's so ridiculously stupid at face value. The the contradictions between having these standards apply to a different country like Russia and refusing to have these standards apply to ourselves or any of our military allies, as in the case of Israel. But just to really put a dot on this to end it, okay, to give you a perspective in terms of how absolutely averse to any accountability the United States has historically been, back in 2002, the United States government passed a law under George W. Bush that was called the American Service Members Protection Act, also known as the Hague Invasion Act, because this law essentially said that if U.S. personnel, military, or presidents like George W. Bush or anybody else was ever brought to The Hague in the Netherlands to face a war crimes tribunal, that the United States would use any power at their disposal in order to remove them, in order to save them from that war crimes tribunal, meaning we are opening the door to literally invading the Netherlands if any U.S. military personnel or otherwise was ever held accountable for war crimes. So listen, when it comes down to it, from a strategic perspective, it doesn't seem like it makes sense for Joe Biden to be coming out here and calling for a war crimes tribunal, because again, it's just going to further back Vladimir Putin into a corner and feel like he has no choice but to double down in the war. If anything, you should be pushing for de-escalation. You shouldn't be pushing for more sanctions, which don't even seem to be working right now. You should be pushing to provide that golden bridge for Putin to retreat across so that you can have some of these concessions made and empower the Ukrainians to make some of these diplomatic efforts actually be tied to economic relief in the form of sanctions relief from the U.S. and the rest of the West. So from a strategic point of view, doesn't really seem like it makes much sense for Biden to be coming out and saying like this. But on top of that, just the absolute glaring and ridiculous hypocrisy. I'm in favor of all war criminals from every other country being prosecuted to the fullest extent. I agree with, in concept, Vladimir Putin being held at The Hague and tried for war crimes in the exact same way I agree with Noam Chomsky, who famously said that if the laws of the Nuremberg trials were applied to today, that every post-World War II U.S. president would have been hung. So, that's the reality. It's a glaring hypocrisy, but also doesn't really seem to make much strategic sense.